Let's enjoy this great game from 1992, game 21, between ex-world champion Boris Spassky and, of course, the American Bobby Fischer, who ended, for a brief time, the Russian domination of chess in the 1950s and 60s. And this is a great game, and it came down to a struggle over pawns in the end, with Spassky resigning. So Bobby Fischer starts with e4, which is a very common move. And Spassky replies with his queenside bishop's pawn. Bobby gets his knight out on the king side, and there will be a swap of pawns in a moment after d4 by Bobby. Spassky takes, and of course Bobby replies by taking with the knight. Spassky refuses the swap with the knights and just pushes his king's pawn up to e6. Again, Spassky refuses to do anything mad here and just pushes his queen's pawn up 1. Now Spassky gets his knight out here on that G rank to f6. Bobby has to come back to cover the pawn on e4. And then from here, it's just moving pieces, so castling can be done by both players. Spassky will castle kingside, and so will Bobby after he moves his bishop onto that second rank. Next move for Bobby now is castling kingside. All very nice, beautiful moves at the moment. Now Bobby just getting his knight on the queen side out to that A rank. And a beautiful position on the bishop, which of course cover the diagonals. And the knight comes central to e5. Yep. The knight on e5 gets pushed away by the pawn on f4. And Spassky just retreating to the back line there. Bobby brings his rook underneath his queen to be a bit more stronger on that d file. Moves back between the king and the bishop on the diagonal. And now Spassky starts to develop the pawn on the king side, and Bobby tucks his king in nice and safe there. And the queen comes on this diagonal on the b file and avoids that exchange there. So queen underneath the bishop, the queen goes back onto the c rank from Spassky. And just players just positioning themselves for more exchanges in a while. Bobby's knight comes back to the b1. Again, that queen on an exchange on that diagonal. But the knight on d2 is covering that pawn on e4. And now we have an exchange of pawn. Spassky takes the pawn on b5. Bobby just pushes his pawn up to block its advance. Queens go back to 8-8 from Spassky. And Bobby just puts his rook underneath that knight on c3. And now Spassky develops his pawn on the E rank. Bobby refuses to take it and threatens the knight from Spassky. And the knight goes to that nice square on D4, threatening the other knight. Bobby has to take. And the pawn on E5 will take the knight. And now Bobby offers an exchange of bishops, which Spassky accepts. Bobby takes back the bishop on C5. Now we have this black pawn of Spassky's on E4, which is protected by the bishop on C6.
Right.
At the moment we have 5 pawns for Spassky and 6 for Bobby, so it's slightly up in material. Let's just have a look at this nice game so far, how it's developed. Exchange of pieces, simplify games. And so we have that knight now onto the E4 square. Spassky doesn't take it with the bishop, of course. But Bobby just maneuvering his other knight to the B3 square. And now that's a nice move by Spassky, forking the rook and the queen, of course, and the knight. The knight has to take, weakest piece, so he takes. And the rook comes down to take the knight, threatening the other knight. Knight goes to D6, and the queen moves down to A4 to support the rook on D4. Bobby gets his pawn forward, and Spassky's rook is supporting his queen on A8. Bobby's rook comes over to B2, and Spassky just pushes his queen down to A3, and Bobby continues to try to push his pawns forward. Of course, Spassky has to take, and now that's a lovely move by Bobby, forking the queen and rook, but of course there's a swap by Bobby on purpose. He already saw that already, planned for this. Takes the piece, and now this is becoming a very interesting game. Bobby's still a pawn up, a rook apiece, 2 rooks apiece, and a queen. And both kings well protected. The rook comes down, the same rank as the black queen, and Bobby protects his king. And there Spassky threatens the rook, but Bobby just pushes the white rook up onto E2. And now more support for Spassky's queen and rook with the other rook. Bobby just puts his rook underneath the black queen. Of course, he can take the pawn on E5. Bobby puts his rook underneath the queen on E5. Spassky blocks with his black rook, and there's an exchange there of rooks. So now the E3 file is controlled by Spassky, and the E5 by the black queen. Meanwhile, Bobby pushes the pawn forward on A rank to A4, and Spassky tries to get on top of these pawns that are coming quickly toward his baseline. The queen moves over to try and help. And that pawn is absolutely hurtling toward the 8th rank. Spassky has to take. And now the queen checks the king. There'll be a few of these checks in a moment. King hides onto the H7 rank. Meanwhile, his left pawn on A is going further and further up the board. Bobby blocks the pawn on the king's side. The queen is supporting his rook. And Bobby's pawn goes up to the 6th rank. And now Bobby puts Spassky in check, and the king is maneuvered into the brown square, easily avoiding that, but now threatening the pawn on that E file. Spassky protects it with his rook, and now puts the king back in check. He'll go back to this. Now it goes to the white square on F6. Sorry, G6. And goes back to the H7 file again. So Bobby doing lots of checks here to manipulate this position. Exchange of queens. Obviously Bobby's rook has to take the queen. And now he has to protect his pawn on the A rank. And of course Spassky will have to try to block it. That means his rook is now tied up. And now it's a matter of the kings going to the center of the board, trying to protect the pawns and trying to get the pawn across the board. Bobby's king that was hidden away on H2 now has to come central to about E4. The king comes to protect his pawn. Bobby responds likewise. So Spassky's king is right behind his pawn, of course. Bobby's rook is covering the king from moving forward. And now Bobby stops Spassky's king going any further forward. And now we'll run out of moves in a moment. So now Bobby has to go back, which allows the pawn to go forward for Spassky. Bobby exchange a pawn here. King has to take the pawn on G5. And now we have a central pawn for Spassky, but now immediately challenged by the king. King can't come next to king, so this pawn is lost. And if it tries to be protected by the rook of Spassky, Bobby will just push his pawn on the A rank and eventually get a queen. So from this point, Spassky resigned, even though material is equal, 2 pawns each, a rook. And so this game, 21, from 1992, was won by the great Bobby Fischer, the American Grandmaster. I hope you enjoyed this game. I certainly have.